And welcome again to Critical Thinking. I'm Professor Borrowdale, and this is our second class. We're going to do a lot more with the concept of critical thinking, talk about what it is, how we apply it, and a little bit more about like how you apply it in different circumstances, and get into talking about arguments. So just a brief announcement. I'm the faculty advisor for Young Americans for Liberty. Meets right before this class on Tuesday. And so our club president has out this term's flyers. We'll be meeting in room 224 in building 1. So it's building 1, room 224. That's AKA Enrollment Services. I think it's at that classroom back behind the TRIO office down that long hallway. But building 1, room 224, Tuesdays 12 to 1. And send this around. I'll post this to the Moodle class as well. We had a good turnout, so I'm really stoked about this year. Seems to be a lot of interest in issues around revolving around human freedom in particular. I think free speech is a kind of a hot button issue right now, so we'll be talking about some of that. We have a smart classroom, so there's probably going to be some students doing some presentations and discussions about that and other topics. So, all right. Let's see, is there anyone who's here for the first time that wants to enroll in the class? Awesome. Did you send me an email like earlier today? Okay, cool. Just catch me during the break and I'll set you up with the ad slip. Let's get right into it. So last time we were talking about, what is critical thinking? So let me just kind of recap and maybe add a couple more things. So critical thinking. Well, first of all, it's thinking versus feeling. So if you're one of those people that's always going, but my feels, and you're constantly living in your feelings and letting them kind of run the show, this class is going to try to help you to get more into your head and to think with your intellect and to move down from like your medulla oblongata, which has a fight or flight response and that sort of visceral reactions to things, and move up into the cerebral cortex where you make decisions. It's the seat of rationality. And to still take your feelings into account when thinking about ends, like the things that you want to happen in your life, and maybe in the larger world. But when you're thinking about means, how to accomplish them, that's when you really got to use your cerebral cortex. I suppose it's all your noodle, right? But the frontal part of your brain, as opposed to that other part of your brain, is a little more primitive and works on instinct. So it's thinking as opposed to feeling. So this is why I think empathy is super important, in particular in this polarized political climate. Empathy is even more important than before. But when it's not necessarily part of critical thinking, although I think it is a part of interacting with other human beings in a productive way. So this is one of the things about the critical thinking, that this isn't a class on persuasive argument. It's not a class in rhetoric. So if you think about, let's see, there's things like civility, empathy, rhetoric. This is this idea of using language and I suppose other things like, I guess it's primarily using, I suppose the other part, I think of rhetoric, and then there's maybe something like public speaking skills. It's not part of rhetoric, but rhetoric is using language to try to persuade people. And when you do things rhetorically, you're not really focused on whether it's a good argument. You're focused on whether it's a persuasive argument. And those aren't always the same thing, right? I can think of actually some really persuasive arguments, which I don't think are very good arguments. And I might disingenuously make them if I really wanted to persuade a person and I wasn't really concerned about something like truth, I suppose. I'm kind of a pragmatist. I'm trying to accomplish some goal. I might disingenuously make appeal to people's baser emotions. You see politicians do this all the time, right? They'll say things they don't really believe, but they know it's going to stir people up. So that's something we want to avoid in this class. So it's really about and this is actually about interacting with others. So these are good. These are things that are. I don't know about the rhetoric. The rhetoric is kind of a mixed bag, right? So I'll just put, these are, I think morally good and also useful. The rhetoric often effective. Yeah, I can't really fit over there, can I? And maybe, I don't know, sometimes rhetoric can be done well when you are able to bring out, say, a moral principle in a way that plain words don't. So effective and can often, and I think maybe morally neutral. So there's good ways to use rhetoric and bad ways to use rhetoric. So like I don't know, if I'm going to make an argument about like the non-aggression principle, I'm thinking about the students, the Young Americans for Liberty group. So one of the things when you think about the use of state power, there's this tactic called pointing out the gun in the room. So so you think, well, under what circumstances should I be able to point a gun at you and force you to do something, right? And you think, well, not a lot of things come to mind, right? When is it okay to point a gun at someone? Well, when someone's pointing a gun at you, when someone's pointing a gun at a friend or a loved one, when someone maybe is trying to steal from you or assault you, right? It's self-defense to protect your life, liberty, and property. Those are cases in which it's okay to use force or violence or the threat of violence against someone else. What if what if I'm building a library? I'm building the Borrowdale Philosophy Library, and I'm looking for ways to fund it. And so I decide the best way to fund it is like the alley back in 14th Street where people usually leave from this bar, and I just sort of accost people and say, collecting donations for the Borrowdale Philosophy Library. You're like, that doesn't sound like it's very ethical. So then the question he asks was, what about when the state does it? And that's actually maybe combining, the rhetorical thing with the argument by analogy. And often often rhetorical arguments will use this argument by analogy, which we'll talk about later. But, and whether, don't get hung up on whether you think it's a valid or invalid argument, but just think about that as a technique of pointing out the fact that the state, so I could put it another way, right? I should say that all state action relies on coercive forms of power, either violence or the threat of violence, right? That's another way of saying it. It's not as effective. If I say that, it's kind of archaic and academic. But if I say everything the state gives you was taken from somebody else, right? It's a little more effective. Or if I say the state points a gun at Peter and the state robs Peter to pay Paul, or the state is a violent institution, or some people the government's is a band of robbers, right? Lysander Spooner used to say that. He's an individualist anarchist from the 19th century. So all those are rhetorical forms, and that they put things in a persuasive form, and they're not necessarily fallacious. But at least they get the point across. But this isn't a course on persuasive speech, right? So critical thinking is using logic and analytical reasoning to make good arguments. And then, if you want to learn how to use rhetoric, take speech and debate class. Get on the forensics team. And that I like to think about that as sort of polishing up the ideas. But where do the good ideas come from? The good ideas come from critical thinking. So how do you know whether you're making a good argument or a bad argument? And there's nothing worse than a bad argument, which is rhetorically really good, right? Like, I don't know, a speech from Adolf Hitler, right? The guy, the guy was a great speech maker. He made great speeches. His ideas were terrible, but he made really good speeches. So in this class, we're trying to work on the ideas themselves and how to make a good case for them or to think about them ourselves. So all these things. I don't want anybody to think, oh, civility doesn't matter, empathy doesn't matter, or that it should be all like when I'm going to try to persuade someone, it should be all logic and no rhetoric. I'm just saying those things aren't part of critical thinking, but they are valuable to varying degrees. I think the first two, the third one again is sort of, I think it's value neutral, and this is kind of like, it makes me think of Kant. He has this sort of thing where the only thing that's good without qualification is a good will. So if you use rhetoric with a good will, then it can be morally good. If you use rhetoric with an ill will or to spread bad values or fallacious arguments, then it's bad. So it's thinking rather than feeling. What about the critical part here? It's critical. What does that mean? What's up?
Importance.
So people say, that's really interesting because people say things are critical. This is one of the problems with the vagueness of language. If you say like, I don't know, philosophy is critical to liberal arts education. That's one use of critical, which just sometimes it's a synonym for importance. The sense of critical we're using for this class is a little different though. Like if you think about critical, what does it mean to be uncritical? Yeah.
To only look at the surface of things, to be, I guess, very basic.
Yeah, to just sort of go with the flow or not be, another way of saying that, not be reflective, right? So to be critical is to be reflective, which is just to think about things. We could say analytical. I don't know if that's a synonym or something different. You want to analyze things. And what are you doing when you're analyzing things?
Observing.
Yeah, do you have a goal when you're just analyzing it because it's fun? Like, I hate puzzles. I hate logical, any kind of a puzzle. Like, I can't play chess. I have no patience for it because I'm like, well, what good is it? And it's like, to me, like doing like, I don't know, just like abstract logical exercises is just kind of like drudgery. It's like doing your taxes or something. But like you think about something that has like what is it, being analytical, what kind of goal does it have? Yeah.
It's kind of like being hard on your opinions by identifying your privileges, biases, and prejudices, and kind of examining them from every angle.
Yeah, so being objective, and I suppose to be critical is also includes this sort of idea of being unbiased or objective. But why would you want to? Those things are really often they're very painful. You might be wrong, and then there might be like you might have like shame or guilt associated with that. When you get to the Clifford reading, he's really big on the shame and the guilt. He kind of lays it on. If you have some uncritical belief, you have on you a stain that can never be wiped away. Is one of the phrases he uses. But why would you want? Why is bias bad? Let me put it that way.
Blinding.
Yeah. So what? Well, why is it bad to be blinded? It's going on. Yeah.
Well, I would say it wouldn't necessarily be bad to be biased. What would be bad would be to allow that to impair your actions or your decisions. Because you can definitely side with a specific group or collective or whatever, but to allow that a kind of association to guide your decisions would be what I would qualify as bad for that.
Yeah. There's a question about whether being biased and having a point of view are different things or the same thing. Maybe this is what you call a semantic difference, but I don't know. Yeah.
It's the idea that like you can have a worldview, but having a biased worldview is when your worldview isn't based on fact, it's based on opinion. So it's like your opinions and your biases altering your worldview makes it kind of an unhonest point of view.
Yeah, but then what the facts according to whom? This is the question that comes up. So this idea of being objective, then why? Okay, here, I'll throw it and take it one step backwards. So why should we care about facts? Like Professor Hegel, the father of the Continental School of Philosophy, is in a famous interchange. A student said, "Herr Hegel, the facts are otherwise," and Hegel replied, "So much the worse for the facts." Right? Why do the facts matter? That seems really, now we're getting really basic.
The facts are unbiased?
Well, I suppose they are, but it's a question about why the facts, and this gets to the purpose of critical thinking, I suppose. This is my next point, but so critical thinking, you want to be biased, objective. Why? Because you're trying to get at the truth, both for yourself, and the idea you find out what the truth is, or the facts, and so what is and so when you want to know what the facts are, the worst thing you can do is just sort of accept what anybody tells you, right? First of all, people are telling you different things, right? They tell you A and they tell you B. Some people think that A and B can be true at the same time in the same respect, which is irrational. And it's one thing people end up having is they have inconsistencies. Now, usually that's not of the form like A and not A. Typically, people have some hidden inconsistencies in their viewpoints that it takes a while to you have to be very reflective to figure it out. Like, oh, wow, I believe this thing over here that I thought was part of this thing, but I believe this thing over here, and I think, oh, these two things can't go together. One of them's got to be wrong. So I think about Lars Larson, right? So I listen to Lars Larson on the radio, and he's always going off the nanny state, and he hates regulations against trans fat and government, nagging people to eat their vegetables and to stop smoking. And he thinks that's an unwanted intrusion of government on people's individual liberty. But he's also a big drug warrior, and he's down on pot smokers, and I think thinks that pot should be criminalized. Although he also does advertisements for cigars with Lars Events and Pendleton whiskey. So I always harass him about that when he goes out the pot smokers. He gets an email from me, or I've tried to call in a couple of times. I don't think I've ever got on. And it's like that's inconsistent, because if you say, well, because all the things you say about pot, you could say about alcohol and cigarette smoking. So it seems like an obvious contradiction, and his drug warrior mentality conflicts with both his constitutional conservatism, because there's nothing in the Constitution about marijuana or regulation of drugs. There used to be something about regulation of alcohol, and people said, oh, we got to pass an amendment for this to be constitutional, for the government to take over this, and then they repealed it again. There's a great bar, if you've ever been in San Francisco, the 21st Amendment, named after the repeal of Prohibition. So there are two inconsistencies, right? The nanny state is bad, but I believe in laws that keep people from smoking pot because it's bad for them. But I do agree with drinking alcohol being legal, and even though the effects on human health and society at large are much worse than smoking pot, right? So and I believe that in strict constitutionalism, but I also believe the federal government should regulate drugs, even though it's not in the Constitution or implied by any of the amendments. So there's two inconsistencies in Mr. Larson's views. So, but why is it bad to have contradictions? I think this guy Emerson, I think, said he's misquoted, saying contradictions are the hobgoblins of small minds. And I'm not sure exactly. He was talking about people that are sort of obsessed with consistency. But if you think about why is it consistency? Why is it bad to be inconsistent?
It shows you didn't really think through your thoughts very long.
Yeah, why?
You compare, contrast.
Why is it bad to be inconsistent? Yeah, it shows that you maybe you're not doing your homework, you're not really thinking, you're not being reflective. But why you want to be reflective? I just keep on going around and around. See, like, what's the point of all this? We got bias, we got this sort of being inconsistent. Let me go back here for a second. Also, to be critical is to be skeptical, to jealously guard your assent to any proposition before accepting it. Yeah.
Does it protect us from like, I guess, like a tyrannical sort of thing, like being fooled and manipulated?
Why is it bad to be fooled or manipulated?
Because someone will take advantage of you.
Yeah, that's true, right? And how do you insulate? I mean, what insulates you from that? Like being taken advantage of or manipulated?
Yourself not having contradictions.
Yeah, but what is it about not having contradictions? What does that get you? What does contradiction get you? Let me put, what's wrong with a contradiction? Let's go really
Going
big.
back to trying to win arguments.
Well, I mean, has to do with like people, like adversarial thing where you're trying to get in a thing, you're trying to win an argument with someone else. What about just like yourself? So you have the belief, so or be inconsistent or have contradictions in your beliefs. I try to write less, but it's always hard, particularly for academics and I think philosophers too, to write less. Because this can go out on the internet, so I can save it and put it in my Moodle class and stuff. So I just need to use more pages here. I always think, oh, I can fit it on. I'll try to respond appropriately to feedback here. So why is it bad to be inconsistent or have contradictions in your beliefs? And any guesses?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're talking to someone about your beliefs and you have holes in what you're saying, then you come off as an irreliable resource, and no one will take you seriously that way.
Yeah. So so there's what's the word? There's a word for that. Nobody's gonna. No, you're just unreliable, right? So you develop reputation, a bad reputation, or unreliability. That's kind of an external thing, though. What does it mean to be unreliable? Unreliability. Why would you consider someone who has contradictory beliefs to be unreliable? Why wouldn't you go to them for advice?
If they're talking about faulty sources, then you can't really trust them.
Well, why would you think their sources are faulty? They just have internal contradictions in their beliefs.
I mean, it has holes in it, so.
Well, what does it mean? What does it mean for something to have holes in it?
None of your
Yeah.
statements, you never know if they're true or not.
Exactly. That's what I was looking for. Sorry. And this might seem obvious. Maybe it was so obvious that nobody thought to say it because they're just assuming it. But philosophy, a lot of philosophy is about making the obvious sort of more obvious and ferreting out these assumptions. A contradiction cannot be true. So, and this is what it means to be unreliable, is to be a source of false beliefs instead of true beliefs. So if someone tells me something, like if someone has the contradictory beliefs, that means, oh, that person's doesn't see the contradiction in their beliefs. And if I bring out the contradiction, they still don't see it. That made me think, well, this person is sort of bad at cognitive processes and unlikely to be reliable to find out facts about the world if they can't think properly. But the reason why contradictions are bad is because a contradiction can't be true. So if you have A and not A, one of those has got to go, right? You can't hold both of those in your mind at the same time. You get, once it's brought out to you, like to be, this word, once it's overt, then you get this thing called cognitive dissonance, where your mind tries to figure out, oh, is it A or is it B? Is it or A or not A or not A? You're going back and forth trying to figure out, and you got to get rid of one. It's really hard unless every time you see a contradiction, you like I don't know, drop acid and meditate or something like that, and try to immerse yourself in the unity of all things, where everything is true and nothing is true. Yeah.
So how would a mathematical field fit into that? Because mathematically, it is possible to, in some very specific situation, say that a contradiction has arrived, or saying one thing exists and saying another that exists, but they can't obviously both exist. And unfortunately, I don't have a specific example to bring forward. But how would that relate to this?
Okay, so this is a really hard question to answer. First, I would dispute that there be any mathematical theorem that would assert that a contradiction can be true. The second thing I would say is that logic is more primary than mathematics, so logic is sort of foundational to everything else. Interestingly enough, if you take all the principles of logic, you cannot derive the principles of mathematics. And sort of the starting place for all thinking, either implicit or explicit, is a contradiction can't be true. Like this happens when you're trying to figure out, like, why isn't my car running, right? And you think about the different possibilities. Could it be that my battery's dead? Nope, check the battery, it's got full voltage. Could it be the alternator? Well, you isolate that and check that. Could it be, that somebody's cut my ignition wires? Okay, you check that, right? Now, why would you think checking all these things and eliminating, these as possibilities is going to work? Well, it's because you think, okay, if my car isn't working, it's either because of this finite set of things that could go wrong, right? And if I know there's only 4 things that can go wrong, and I eliminate 3, I know the one that's left is the one. Why? Because the contradiction can't be true, and because there's this, the way logic works, that if there are 4 possibilities and 3 of them don't work, the one remaining one has to be true. Like if you do that with I guess it's disjunctive, complicated form of disjunctive syllogism, right? It's A or B or C or D. It's not A, it's not B, it's not C. It has to be D by logic, right? The way that works, it works on this idea that a contradiction can't be true, is sort of the primary axiom of logic. And quantum physics has this thing with Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, and some people bring up quantum physics to try to get at this sort of idea that things aren't determinately either true or false. And the idea, so quantum physics has this sort of idea of a quantum state that's only, that the idea that this is actually the Copenhagen interpretation of Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, and basically it says that you can never know how fast an electron is going and where it's at. So you can't know position and velocity at the same time. And the idea is that you don't know until you've observed, or it's nothing's true about it until you've observed it. And the Copenhagen interpretation of Heisenberg is that the reason you can't know is because it's indeterminate. It's neither true nor false. And there's this thought experiment called, and I'll just mention this, Schrodinger's cat. Is that what you're going to mention, or something else?
No, I was going to say the information theory.
Hold that thought for just a minute. S-H-R-O-E, Dinger. Schrodinger's cat. It's a thought experiment. Speaking of cats, right? So Schrodinger's cat is a thought experiment, or Schrodinger says, okay, imagine there's a cat in a box, and he's in there with a radioactive element, and there's some sort of mechanism such that there's a 50% chance that the radioactive element will be dispersed in the box, killing the cat. Okay, now the time has passed and the mechanism is either activated or hasn't. The question is the cat either alive or dead before you open the box, or only when you open the box? And before you open the box, is it true that the cat is either alive or dead? I just asked that question. What do you think?
Also true, because it doesn't come into existence until we view it, and then that's when it determines.
Really? So like if I go like this, do you cease to exist, and do you only exist when I go like this?
I mean,
That's how like that's how we
to you
look.
maybe for a little bit.
I mean, that's the way, like, but I mean, that's the way, like, you know, maybe kids think, right? Like, if you're, like, you play, or like maybe small animals, like you have a pet, and your cat sticks his head into a box, and he thinks that you can't see him because he can't see you. But in reality, right, you can see the cat, his butt sticking out of the box, and you see his tail going back and forth, and you're like, my cat's, you think it's cute, right? Because the cat thinks you can't see him because he can't see you. Or you play peekaboo with, you know, the little toddler because he thinks this is a fun game. You can make things appear and disappear. But once he gets to be a certain age, he realizes there's an objective world, and that there's a difference between what he perceives and what exists in reality. And maybe later on you get in college and read David Hume and you might question that. But it seems like that's a sort of basic way of existing in the world, that there's a difference between subjective experience and belief and reality. Yeah.
So does that basically say that our perception can't alter reality in any way? That we have no effect on what's about to happen or what is happening?
If there's any. So by effect, you mean just by perceiving?
Yeah, like the observance
Yeah.
becoming what is observed.
Part of it might depend on whether you're using an instrument to observe. So sometimes, like one of the objections to this sort of weird quantum physics things, people will say, look, when you're observing, you're affecting the state. So if you're observing because, like, to figure out, I don't know, to figure out like what particles do, they bash them together at millions of miles an hour and see what happens. Or like, okay, say if I turn on a light, and there are like worms there that are light sensitive, and they curl up in a ball when the light's turned on. You know, every time I turn the light, that's having an effect, right? But I can't see the worms in the dark. So if I do something to disturb the physical environment, then I'll get a change. But if I can observe without affecting physically what I'm observing, then no, it doesn't have any effect.
But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I really might be when I say this, but I'm fairly certain that I have read that there are instances, like on the anatomical level, where our observance does have an effect on the reality. Just the fact that we're observing.
You mean on the atomic level?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, well, then everything's composed of atoms. If we have an effect on the atomic level, what's to say that we can't affect our physical environment just by perception?
There was a test that actually did prove that, right? Is where they sent electrons through slits.
All right, hold on, one at a
I
time,
guess.
one at a time. Okay, first let me get him and then you. Go ahead.
So there was an actual test, and they tested it with electrons, and they beamed particles of electrons near a wall, right? And there was 2 slits.
Yeah.
Now, when they shot those particles, if I remember correctly, it created 2 slits, which is fine. But when they didn't look at it, it would actually create waves, and it would create a different. It would change depending whether they stared at it or didn't. Yeah, it's not exactly. Oh, what was it?
This is a double slit experiment. I'm familiar with that.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's kind of like that.
Now, the thing is, like, not all scientists agree that's what it shows. Like, people use that to try to show that. Then the question comes, you know, which are you more sure of? That, you know, some guys doing some experiments say that when I look away, things change, and like just by like looking at something and thinking about something, it's causing an effect in the world. Or are you sure like that a contradiction can't be true? Or, you know, that, okay, think about it in the abstract, right? So, you know all the facts about this box. You know that there's a 50% chance the radioactive element will disperse. You know the laws of physics. You know what the radioactive element it will kill living beings, including a cat. So there's the box now. There's a 50% chance the cat is dead. There's a 50% chance the cat is alive. Any theory that tells you the cat is neither alive nor dead, or both alive and dead in the same time, in the same respect, is Looney Tunes. When you open the box, one of two things is going to be true. But opening the box has no effect on the cat, right? The cat right now is either alive or he's dead. There's no sort of in between, right? It's just you can't tell. There's a difference between observation and reality. Yeah.
What about like quantum computers? You can have qubits that are 1, 0 or 1, 0 at the same time. They can be any of those at any given point until we determine.
They use a different base coding, they use ternary for that, not binary.
Well, yeah, but I mean, spins of those still, they can be 1, 0.
But this is like mathematical modeling of reality. This isn't like you can't directly observe quantum states, right? You can look at like microphysical particles, and actually you're really looking at the unless if it's something smaller than an atom, you're looking at the results of smashing them together. You have an electron microscope that can sort of see pretty deep, but only a lot of these experiments, that even the double slit experiment, you're looking at physical phenomena, and then there's this theory about what's happening at the microscopic level, and it's highly based on mathematics. And so the idea is these are mathematical models, and a way of understanding things is by thinking about things in terms of functions or probability. But that's not telling you that reality is not determinate. It's just a way of mathematically modeling certain things that we see happening to try to predict future results. Now, if you say, if I say a contradiction can be true, and that and that something can be both true and false at the same time or indeterminate until I observe, it seems like all sorts of crazy things happen. Like, for example, I could say the double slit experiment both shows that that truth is depends on observation and that it does not. Right? That's just nonsense words. It's like saying that my friend Joe helped me bake a cake that I baked all by myself. Right? That's not even, that's like a meaningless statement.
You're looking at the aftermath of the experiment instead of looking at what's happening during the experiment. They were looking at the aftermath, not during. So what it was exactly was they shot electrons at 2 slits, and then when they weren't looking, it would only make 1 slit, but when they looked, it would make 2 slits.
So I guess the question would be, do the computers register both axes? Like, can the computer see both forms without us looking at it, or?
It was registering what heat signatures were going off in the back of the wall when the electrons came in contact with it. And so
what do you
they
mean
did
by
is they'd
what do you
shoot
mean
and
by
they'd see that it
looking
just
at
create
it?
a heat line.
Like there's a guy in a lab coat there, or what do you mean?
Like they were using a computer just to study what the movements of energy were, and they were thinking that it was deciding that instead of going through both slits, it would go through both at the same time and then reconnect it one,
Right, yeah.
and that's what would create the 1 slit.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't do that if it was being watched. It would decide, well, I can go through this one, and there's a 50% chance. But if I don't have anybody observing whether that's the case, then I'm just going to do both at the same time.
Now, what do you mean by observing? Do you mean recording? Do you mean somebody?
Recording, trying to figure out where they're going, trying to study where the electrons are going, why they're doing that, what part of the wall it's hitting. Basically that intermediate part, right before it chooses.
Yeah.
Right before it makes the decision. That's what we're trying to see. And when we try and see that, it decides something different.
Well, when you say it decides, you make it sound like it has volition or something like that.
I mean, but that's the weird part about it. That's what's goofy.
Yeah. See, I would dispute that's a conclusion about the double slit experiment. I'd say the double slit experiment is sort of it's a strange phenomena. I would say, okay, if you conclude that reality changes based on whether you observe it, that the the extrapolation from all that makes nonsense of your everyday experience, and violates things that that you believe and act on every day.
I mean, I guess it depends on what you think the world is. I mean, there's the theory of that it's all virtual and it's not actually real.
Yeah, and then you know, try that for, you know, there's I suppose you could say now the question is so the question is what, I suppose, what's your evidence for that? If you think about like the different theories of what our experience is, you know, what's your evidence for this theory, and what's its predictive value versus some other theory? I would say that the common sense view of an objective world independent of observation, you know, is what gave rise to science in the first place and what makes the double slit experiment even possible. And the very scientific method, which says you have a hypothesis and you test it empirically, and then you see what the results are, and then it gives you predictive power, is all predicated on the objective worldview. So the idea that you would find an experiment that would say, oh, like suddenly, there is no objective reality, it's dependent on observer, you know, it depends on the observer that something's not true or doesn't happen until you observe it. You know, what's like the theoretical underpinning for that, you know, that view? It seems that there's no, that seems like a big conclusion to leap to based on this experiment. Yeah, go ahead.
There's a book called The Hidden Messages in Water. Have you ever read that? It's by Dr. Masaru Emoto.
I'm somewhat familiar too. I haven't read the book. I'm familiar with the ideas in it. So
basically, like for the rest of the class, I guess, like the most basic experiment that's outlined in this book, it's been repeated by millions and it has the same result every time. It's that when you take 3 pots of water or 3 pots of water with rice, and you speak nicely to one, you speak meanly to the other, and you ignore the third, the one that you ignore is going to rot and fester a lot faster than even the one that you speak negatively to, though that one will pretty much do the same. And the one that you speak positively to will basically just ferment. So it'll smell a little funny. It's like what happens to alcohol. So in this book, the doctor who does this study, he's been doing it for over a decade, and he's received the same results time and time again, is that he takes microscopic pictures of ice crystals after they freeze. And each sample he either speaks to, writes a note to, or interacts with in some way, and it changes the way that the ice crystals form. And in some water, like in water that's been polluted past the point of even being drinkable, it can't form ice crystals. But after you've spoken positively to it or shown it a positive message, literally like taping a message onto a petri dish and not saying it, it will form perfect ice crystals every time. So that is actual scientific proof that our words and our messages and how we feel does directly impact the world in a very real and scientifically proven way. So, and we are all made of water, you know what I mean? We exist mostly as water, and a lot of our world does as well. So we do have an impact. So I'm just saying that, like, the idea that we don't impact our reality in any way and that everything is already predisposed and chosen, that there's one truth, it is a flawed idea. It's not necessarily the truth. That's still up for debate.
So that experiment that you just, the facts of the experiments on water is that are the conclusion you drew, is that true or not? The conclusion that that we can affect our thoughts affect physical reality.
It is true.
Would that be considered?
But you just said a moment ago that there's the idea that certain things are determinately true is a flawed idea.
It's the idea that we have an impact on our reality. Not that there's any, like, that there's no solid form of reality. It's that we have an impact on it, and we decide the reality that does take place.
So you accept that there's one determinate reality and say we have an effect on it?
I accept that there is a determinate reality, but I don't accept that it's a set determinate reality. So it's not a set reality, it's one that we progressively create.
So in which reality does the like rice ferment? Is it all happening in this reality or some other reality? Like you're talking about this sort of idea. I mean, obviously different things happen in the world, different things happen, right? So rice ferments in one pot, and it doesn't ferment another pot, according to in this experiment. But it's all happening in one reality. We can all observe it, right? That's your point, that you're providing evidence for a conclusion that that thoughts affect physical reality.
Right.
So this seems like that's not attacking this idea that there's one determinate truth about the world.
Well, the fact that the way that we think and experience and verbalize our opinions toward an object, so in this example, toward rice, if you're
Yeah.
directly speaking, I know it sounds crazy, to rice,
Yeah,
then we affect what happens to that rice,
right.
whether or not it rots or ferments. That means that we have a direct impact on the reality of the rice.
But now
Go
you're doing one
ahead.
Yeah, so I have a,
Oh, one at a time.
is it
Him
a theory
first.
or is it a hypothesis using the
She's suggesting this is she's drawing a conclusion based on this argument. Here's this experiment, and here's what happened. And so therefore, the conclusion is the evidence from this experiment is that our thoughts affect physical reality. And what I was saying was that it doesn't seem to have any impact on this idea that we live in a one determinate reality, and that one set of facts is true, and things and the world is one determinate way. You're arguing that the world is one determinate way, that it is such that our thoughts have effects on physical reality. That's the whole point of the experiment, right? To try to establish that. There's no idea that, it's like for you it's true and for me it's not. You're trying to persuade me that this is the way that the world is.
Maybe.
I'm trying to persuade you of what?
That this is the way the world is, that our thoughts affect reality. Right. So so it's not, in other words, it's not a relativistic argument.
Okay, I can
Right.
accept that.
Okay. All right. I just
guess.
want so we're talking about this question that Schrodinger's cat says that, well, the reality is, this is an argument that reality is one determinate way. That either the cat's either alive or he's dead. He can't be both or neither. We know that the radioactive element has either killed him or it hasn't, and it doesn't matter whether you've opened the box or not. It is true that he's alive or dead, but you don't know until you open the box. So there's a difference between what you believe and know, and you don't know until you open the box. But it's still true. There's a reality that we can't know until we open the box, but there's a reality about whether the cat is true, whether the cat is alive or dead. So it's either true the cat is alive or it's true the cat is dead. It can't be both or neither. So the difference between our belief and reality. And now you're saying that people's beliefs affect reality, but that's part of the assumption that one thing is true. And you're setting up this sort of, I don't know, call it a causal law in the universe, that your beliefs can have an effect on reality. But that's still part of the objective worldview. You're not saying that's not an argument for relativism, that each person has their own truth.
How can you prove that it's not true that the cat isn't dead or alive? Because you can never view it.
Oh, so I'd say you can't know it? Well, you can't know whether the cat is alive. You can't know whether the cat is dead.
So then who's to say it wouldn't be both?
But you can know that because it can't be both. The cat can't be both alive and dead, because those are opposite concepts.
But I mean, you're claiming life is just something much more than just particles.
Okay, we define life as in a certain way, the heartbeat, respiration, and so on and so forth, right? The biological definition of life. And we know through past experience that radiation at a certain dosage will kill a living being, like a cat of a certain size. And as you have a certain intensity of radiation, right, you're all qualified. And so then after the mechanism activated, maybe you press a button, right? And then you haven't opened the box yet, and you say, well, 50% chance the cat's alive, 50% chance it's dead. Let's see which it is. But you never say, oh, maybe the cat is both alive and dead. And before you open the box, you don't think, well, okay, either the cat's alive or he's dead, or he's both alive and dead, or he's neither alive nor dead. You assume the cat's state is the same before you open the box as suppose someone opens the box and they look and they see the cat, but you haven't seen the cat. You don't ask, so is the cat alive, dead, or neither alive nor dead? Because you haven't looked.
But then the reality's been created.
It's been observed.
Well, it hasn't been observed
But
by
for
you.
some reason, all of us have the same reality. But I mean, what is our perception of time? Why does time go forward? Technically, you could consider that as us changing reality.
Yeah,
Time can be very different depending on if we're viewing it or where we are.
There is relativity for time, but I think that's different from even like with relativity with regards to time. It's different from this idea that reality is relative. That's a weird thing about the space-time continuum, that if you accelerate a mass and you can actually warp space-time. But that again, that's part of the objective worldview. The warping of space-time at extremely high speeds is something that's been proven by first theoretically posited by Einstein and then proven by experiment. So you had a point. I hope we don't go by it, but there's a bunch of stuff bouncing around. So
I was thinking like that seemed like a little bit less observation than a direct intention. But even on that same path, it's like even when we intake information through our eyes, like it causes a change inside of us, which will either raise our heartbeat, keep it the same, lower it, which will change how much we're heating up a room or not heating up a room, which may have an effect on the water and the crystals. That's a little bit extreme, I feel, like to overly put in the EM field.
Wait, can I respond to
I
that?
go ahead.
Just because, it was kind of a directed comment. But I should say that in this experiment, a large portion of it was just blindfolded men putting a note underneath a petri dish of water and walking out of the room. I'm not saying that your bodily effect wouldn't have the same, like something on the ice crystals, but it wouldn't. So I am saying that actually,
Yeah.
like the amount of heat that your body puts off, the rate of your heart, that doesn't change the structure of water.
Well,
Like it
maybe it does.
Well, it doesn't.
I would say that seems more.
Like-
That seems to me more plausible.
Are just the simple vision
Yeah.
our states are somehow affecting the way the computer is registering, if it's an interference pattern or if it's just a straight.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'm not really sure what that is, but I don't get how that.
Now, what if
works.
someone? Let me ask. What if someone were to say, "Well, our thoughts don't affect physical reality either. It's just it's the electrons floating around our brain." Like when you make the assertion, like, "Well, this one thing doesn't cause this other thing," it seems like you're sort of relying on these scientific laws that we have about the effect of say heat, or I would say like if you have a person, somebody just breathing, on the pot of water might have some effect if there's water particles and bacteria in their mouth and so on and so forth.
But it wouldn't cause the water to form perfect ice crystals when it was not physically possible beforehand. So like that small amount of bacteria or the temperature of your body scientifically can't make water form an ice crystal if it wasn't capable of.
You have this perception that all scientific method is true though, and that's not true at all, because a hypothesis is formed by one person, a theory is formed by multiple people testing that hypothesis to be true. So that's what you said, right?
Well,
So that would be a theory of scientific method. That's what you just stated.
Well, I think one thing that.
And so for what I stated earlier was the information theory, was that we truly don't know based off of, we don't know to the exact, especially with the atoms thing, we don't really know with the electrons how they function or what their movement is. And what you were stating with life, like,
What is life?
I mean, like, life is a very, like, basic, it's a perception. You can look at it biologically, not mathematically or physically, or into your own, like, religious and moral beliefs. But I mean, like, to her point, like,
Well, I say that life has nothing to do with morality.
No. Okay, so the scientific method that she is talking about with the water experiment, even though that is true with like the Schrodinger's cat experiment, even though that is to be true, we don't know that that is a direct result. Like the temperature, the humidity, the good positive energy that you're putting on the rice, we don't know that that's a direct correlation to why the rice is actually.
It's correlated, but the question is it causing?
It's not a
or is there
causation,
some
it's not
other-
a correlation, it's a
Yeah.
causation.
The question about
Yeah.
whether something else might be causing
Or
it.
vice versa.
And looking at like the evidence for experiments, one thing that's important to look at is like who's doing the experiment and then whether it's been replicated in controlled conditions by other researchers. And I'd say that particular case there, the only person I'm aware of that's doing that sorts of experiments is that researcher. And I
There is
don't know that
another
it's
one. There
been,
is another guy.
there's another, but,
I didn't read
but
about
it hasn't
too much.
been, hasn't been
But it's hard
replicated.
it's hard to replicate
Oh,
the
yeah.
exact experiment over and over and over again.
There might, I mean, there might be
Almost
two
like
researchers, right? But it's not like the scientific community that's doing researches on things like genetic engineering or nanotechnology or something like that. And it's not being done at MIT or Harvard. It's being done by this one researcher and maybe some other guy that kind of, is into the same sort of esoteric, beliefs that he is. It's not broad. That's not something that's broadly accepted by the scientific community or experiment that's been replicated in the mainstream university. So at least that's something to look at when you're looking at the evidentiary value and looking at other. To me, it seems similar to the cold fusion experiment done by Pons and Fleischmann in the 80s. And nobody else could replicate it, and it looks like it was experimental error, although there are still people that believe and write books about cold fusion. Well, we were way past break time, so let's take 10 minutes, we'll come back at 10 after the hour.
Yeah, I can find that study though. It was something about.
we have to have a
But I mean, like,
centralized
you know,
location.
I wrote-
Okay. Lots of lively, animated discussion about this. That's good, I like it. Okay, so this is a recap. So Masaru Emoto claims that people's thoughts, intentions, particularly positive ones, I don't know if he's has he done stuff with negative attitudes?
At the same time.
Yeah, he's done negative, positive, neutral, that kind
Effect.
of thing. But he does hypothesize that the positive have more of an effect because it's natural, because it's a natural thing, and like negativity is human-made.
Water. And then we also talk about the double slit
Well,
experiment.
if you think about like in like the animal kingdom and things like that.
So I'll say one thing. Let me just.
This state.
Yeah, go ahead. Did you want to comment on that? Okay. I want to make sure we sort of direct things centrally. I'll try not to monopolize the conversation, but I want to be able to direct it too. So let me. I just come back to. Oops, I got a blank one here. Come back to this. So, when I'm aware of both these experiments. One, a more traditional quantum physics experiment. Another one, which is what I would call what I would classify as pseudoscience, meaning that it's not part of mainstream science, and it may use something like this, something that looks like the scientific method, but other scientists don't regard it as being scientific. So if you ask I would go to the Department of Physics or molecular biology at any American institution, or even international institutions, and academic institutions of mainstream science, and you ask them, well, what do you think about this experiment? And they'll say, well, it's not true science, or they'll tell you there's experimental error, and then they'll come up with like a laundry list of alternative explanations, other than that thought vibrations or prayers can affect the molecular composition of water. So then the question is, when you're trying to figure out whether to accept that or not, doesn't mean necessarily that you shouldn't accept it, but it means that the burden of proof sort of goes up pretty high, that you'd have to think, well, it seems, on the one hand, it's really startling, all these claims he's making, and then on the other hand, maybe I did the experiment myself and I got the same thing that happened, but I have all these other physicists that say that it's scientifically invalid, and nobody else has even. The other scientists think it's so implausible that they're not even going to waste their time on it. I might think about, well, is the scientific community biased against these sort of thoughts, and that they have an irrational bias against this sort of interpretation of reality, maybe, right? But then the question is why, like you look at all sorts of other things, like the science that goes behind airplanes and your iPhone and your computer and all the stuff you use every day, like that, the scientists seem pretty reliable about giving foundations for those things. And so the question is, why should you disregard mainstream science and these other things? Or maybe they're good at, like, say, I don't know, taking care of your teeth, for example, or doing quadruple bypass surgery to preserve your life. Like, you rely on science for those things, but and you think, well, mainstream science is good for rockets and spaceships and genetic engineering and life-saving cancer cures, but I'm going to be skeptical when it comes to, or I'm going to disregard what they say about this this idea that prayers or thoughts can affect water. One thing I know about Dr. What's his name? Dr. Tell me his name again. Masoko.
It's
Masath. I had his name. I wrote his name down here. There we go. Masaru Emoto. I got the names reversed. But this one thing about him, he showed up in like this movie, What the Bleep Do We Know, that espouses lots of these sorts of theories that aren't part of mainstream science about we create our own reality and so on and so forth. But you won't find people at Harvard or MIT or Stanford, people that actually do work in physics, accepting any of his conclusions. So the question you might ask yourself is, well, why not? Is it some sort of a irrational bias, or do they have like good arguments about why maybe even out of hand they might be skeptical of these claims? I suppose we could do an experiment in this class, right? We might try that. Like one thing you might do to try to avoid experimental errors, you could do it like across the country, right?
That's
Because
been done.
so then the question is, so by whom though, right?
I mean, no, literally, like, it's a fairly well-known experiment. I know many teachers who have their classrooms do it, actually, and like, it's actually a pretty well-known thing that has been done all over the world.
So do they have like a control group?
Yeah, that's technically the one that you ignore, but that
Right.
one actually rots faster than the one that you're negative toward. His conclusion from that is that ignoring something's actually more damaging to it than speaking negatively to it.
Okay, so we could try a little experiment in this class, see what happens. Well, one question I would have too is like why he hasn't accepted like the James Randi challenge. James Randi has this $1 million prize for people that can establish paranormal phenomena under laboratory conditions, rigidly controlled scientific conditions. And the idea is that if you can, can prove some paranormal phenomena actually exists, you get $1 million. And he's got the money sitting in an account there waiting for someone. And so far, nobody has been able to do it.
So would it be paranormal if you're finding a reaction from our presence on the room? He was saying like it'd be really good if we simply just did strictly audio. No one's in the room, we just auditorily
Control the temperature
Yeah.
just right and just have purely
so
audio.
you know we're not changing temperature, we're not affecting it within any kind of hard frequency, it's just strictly the words of our intentions. But still, that kind of gets down to sound waves, and that could.
There's lots of things. This is one of the things that's hard to control experiments to make sure like your control group and experimental group are exactly the same, and the conditions are exactly the same. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, you want to make sure that the difference is caused by the variable that you're testing, right? So, but what does that rely on? That relies on this idea that if you have two things that are exactly the same and you add a new stimulus to them, to one and not the other, that any changes there are due to that stimulus if everything else is exactly the same. That's a matter of logic.
If the stimulus of thought is the stimulus, then that's what proves it.
Right. So you're assuming if you have two pots of water under exactly the same conditions, except for one variable, which is people are putting positive thoughts in a slip of paper underneath them, or speaking positively, and there's a change. You'd say, well, that change is due to that difference in the two states. If everything else is exactly the same, that's how you do science. So then the question is, if there's a difference, the question you ask is are things exactly the same, or are there some other variables, or is there a variable associated with a variable that you think is causing the change that might be different? Like if someone's speaking, is it bacteria in the water droplets that they're projecting when they speak? Is it that they have to get closer to the pot of water to put the slip of paper under? So there's like lots of what you call experimental error, where you can end up with differences that don't really represent the differences introduced by your variable. But I think the answer here is like if you think, well, the experiment gives a crazy conclusion, is not to say, well, science is not reliable, or that science is relative, or any of these other things that I kind of heard popping up in conversation. It's just that there might be some alternative explanation of the experiment. I'd say the same thing about the double slit experiment. That there are like varying interpretations of them. The Copenhagen interpretation, which is the sort of idea that the state is indeterminate, is partly it's this idea of expressing that what's happening in terms of a probability wave, which is a mathematical modeling of a physical phenomena, which is not a metaphysical assertion that reality is relative, and I think that's an important distinction. And second of all, it's questioned by a lot of people, including Schrodinger, who was a quantum physicist, and rejected the Copenhagen interpretation of physics, this idea of relative states. Yeah.
The human error aspect is that called measurement uncertainty principle, or is that something else?
That's why a part of it's like one part of experimental error. There's lots of ways in which experiments can go wrong. In Russia, they had this thing where they thought they discovered this new form of water called polywater, and it was like more viscous than regular water, seemed to behave in odd ways. And it turned out what was happening is the experimenters were working in a very hot room, and they actually sweated, and their sweat, the water droplet particles had either evaporated or actually dripped into the sample and causes changes, right? So salt and whatever bodily oils, had mixed in with this pure water they studied that was like uncovered. So that's, again, they thought they'd had this new thing like the cold fusion, and it turns out when other people tried to replicate it or study it closely, they said, okay, I see what's going on there. It's kind of like when you think you have ghosts in your house, and it turns out there's some weird problem with your furnace that's making weird kind of moaning sounds in the middle of the night, and it's just like a pipe that's got a hole in it, or some kind of mechanical thing.
So I wonder if that rice experiment would work if you just used thought, like you didn't speak, there was no sound, nothing like that. You were just mentally focusing on that bowl or whatever.
And I don't know, like, a lot of the details of, like, how he did this, and I think he hasn't had, to my mind, he has volunteers, but he hasn't had independent scientific observers from mainstream universities to come and observe experiments. It's just he has this sort of, I'll call it like a belief in sort of paranormal or esoteric forces, which can't be measured directly. Like, you can't measure thought waves, and all the physical causation of these things can't be detected. He's looking at the indirect effects, and he has some interpretation of that. And like, to me, I wouldn't assent to that unless I had some good.
Delta.
What's that?
You can measure thought waves. There's theta, delta.
But we're not talking about like electrical activity in the brain. We're talking about something else, right? Like positive intentions, or the effects of prayer.
That's internal.
I think that one actually
Well,
does.
we can read your thoughts.
Because I mean, basically, like, let's see, how do they read? I guess they read it with an EEG.
Yeah, I mean, your brain produces minute electrical voltage. I think this goes with what you were talking about. You're saying, well, it's not the heat signature. It's not the extra body heat. It's not this or that. And we know that about the brain, there's just electrochemical impulses, and we kind of understand how those work and how powerful they are. And they're just they're not powerful enough to create the effects that we're seeing. So that's not a likely possibility. Although I maybe look at it and it would turn out there'd be some effect. But what he's measuring, I mean, this idea of prayer or of positive energy, like, you can't measure these positive energies. There's no like positive energy meter, right? So he's positing paranormal forces which can't be detected as the cause of these things. So I think that skepticism is probably warranted more so with that than if you're studying known forces that can be measured and quantified. So let me come back to the more basic. I'll say, so let me make this I'm going to use this to illustrate the law of excluded middle. To maybe illustrate this, what I'm kind of dancing around here in talking about this. So that this says that a proposition is either true or false, and there's no sort of in between. So I'll just put, I have a more, in the handout I had in Moodle, which you should look at if you haven't seen it already, puts this in more detail, but I'm just going to write a proposition that's, well qualified, well defined, a meaningful declarative statement is either true or false. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, who first discovered this, that for any statement of fact, or a putative statement of fact, right? It's either going to be true or it's going to be false. It can't be both true and false, or neither true nor false. And if sometimes there's a problem with like, well, what does it mean? You know, and things that people say, well, maybe it's kind of seems like it's true, but maybe it's not true in this respect. There's probably some vagueness about like the way you've described it. Like if I say, well, you know, it's raining outside, and then you go outside and it's kind of misting. Like, there's little like random rain droplets coming down. There's like little tiny like mist, and you're like, is that really rain or is it more like a fog? So that's just a matter of, you know, language has vagueness. So I could say, you know, there is, you know, some precipitation, and I'll say, okay, by rain, I don't mean, I'm including sprinkling, I'm including fog, I'm including, you know, maybe I'll do all those things. Like it was foggy this morning, so, but it wasn't really raining. So maybe I would qualify like, you know, over, if I wanted to be really careful, I'd say, well, like more than, you know, 0.1 inches or something like that per hour of rain. So it's something that's actually measurable. Then we have a well-qualified determinate proposition. And so it will never be the case that it's both raining and not raining outside in the same place at the same time, right? Either it's raining or it's not raining. And what will make that statement true is that it's raining. What will make that false is that it's not raining, given our putative definition of raining, right? So this idea that it can't be that it's kind of raining, kind of not raining. What if you get a result like that, you've got a vague proposition, so you just need to make your proposition more exacting. And this is a sort of illustration of the correspondence theory of truth. And the correspondence theory of truth says that truth is the way the world is. So a true statement is one that describes the world the way it actually is. A false statement describes the world in a way other than it is, right? So and by truth, we just mean, you know, we could say reality. We might say, you know, that's a bad looking arrow. The facts. What is the case? Right? All these are synonyms of talking about the same thing. Truth is a quality that applies to statements or beliefs. A proposition is just kind of like the abstract, true or false thing. So philosophers like to talk about propositions because sometimes you get into problems with beliefs, you know, being this sort of mental representation. And what is a belief? And, you know, philosophers will say, well, belief is a propositional attitude. It's an attitude you have towards the true or false thing, such that you either assent to it, you accept it, or you don't assent, you reject it. Or maybe you just, you know, you're ambivalent. And so there's lots of sort of special problems with understanding consciousness and reality. And then you can have like a statement that might be written, it could be verbal, and then it could be in a particular language. So they talk about sentences being a proposition expressed in a particular language. And then there's this question about translation, right? So the philosophers like to talk about propositions. In this class, I'll talk about propositions or beliefs as a nice shorthand statement. But basically, it's there's beliefs and statements are expressions of propositions. They say that the world is a certain way, and then if the world is that way, they're true. If the world isn't that way, they're false. Now, what if we can't tell? Well, if we can't tell whether they're true or false, then we don't know. But we know that they're either true or false. They're not, there's no in between.
For our reality.
No, period.
I don't know, I feel like a being could have different realities. Like, okay, this is obviously pretty crazy, but if you were a fourth dimensional being, it could be, well, I guess it would be like fifth dimensional. It could be raining in the same place, but it also could not be. That would be a true reality for them. To us, it wouldn't be, because we're not in that form or dimension. But if you were in that reality, your reality would be completely different compared to ours.
So I'd say this whole idea
Which
of
is true,
multiple, the idea of multiple dimensions where different things are true would still be part of like the broad idea of like a, you know, super reality, like the multiverse or something, right? So it would be true there are multiple dimensions, and it would be true that different different states of affairs obtained in different dimensions. But it wouldn't say that different things would be true. When you say like this reality to me, you just mean, well, in this one particular, say, world or
Well, I guess it depends if you can actually exist in those types of.
well, I mean, it's all like highly theoretical, right? And, you know, this sort of idea of multiple realities is still a hypothetical idea.
I mean, time is the fourth dimension, and the fifth dimension you could say is basically time, and left to right, and the sixth is up and down, which is positioning.
But the whole idea of the up and down, I mean, that's a metaphor, right?
Well, yeah.
The whole, I mean, the
obviously,
whole
but-
string theory is like the whole idea, like you think about, you know, talking about particles or waves, those are metaphors too.
It's just a way of explaining it.
Right, so you think about like what, but then the question is, like, you're thinking about reality, you could say, well, there are different universes or something,
Yeah.
but that would be part of reality, right?
Yeah.
You're still talking about reality, and either there are multiple universes or there aren't. So there's no like reality to you or to me, there's just reality.
I think
Right.
they could point to a different truth,
Sort of.
even if we might think that one is
But
true.
when you're talking about a different truth, what do you mean?
Something that we have overlooked. If we stop thinking about, you know, different aspects of life, then
But you can have a.
like I don't think there's ever an absolute truth. I think there will always be something that we'll uncover that will change our reality.
Is that statement true?
I don't know.
That truth
Is it both
progressive.
true and false? Is it neither true nor false?
Because if truth was progressive, it would progress away from the fact that truth is progressive.
Well, you just made an assertion, right? About you made an assertion that that there's no such thing as absolute truth. But the question is that statement you made, is it absolutely true, or is it only true for you, right? And so it seems like if you say it's only true for you, I might say, well, that's an interesting like report about your mental state, but I'm interested in reality, right? But if you say it's absolutely true, then it's self-refuting, it seems.
So, for
Yeah.
example, though, like gene theory, when does a theory become true, though? Because gene theory has been proven for like a while now, but yet you're saying that it's based off of the perspective, because there are some people, I'm assuming, that don't believe in gene theory, right? So how does,
You know, do you mean talk about like this genetics or?
yeah,
like-
genetics.
Well, I mean, there's people that there's people that don't believe in epilepsy. They think like when some guy falls and convulses on the ground, he's got an evil spirit and needs to be exorcised.
No, I know. So
There's people
when
that think
does
the
a
Earth is
theory
flat.
become true, though? That's my question.
So it doesn't become true. It is true if it corresponds with reality.
Okay.
Now, whether we know it's
But
true
isn't
is a
that only
second
based off
question.
of your perspective, though?
No.
That's what I'm saying.
Wait, so
No.
why are these things like on a broader example, like
Yeah.
or a widely known example, like tectonics theory, like the idea that we're like the lithosphere is floating on this sphere and we're colliding and go. It's
Yeah.
a theory. It's widely accepted. It's taught in classrooms. It's not addressed in a lot of ways as a theory.
Yeah.
It's taught as fact.
Right.
When does it become fact?
When we
I think that
I was trying to use a more
Yeah,
broad, more
so
broad basis.
it doesn't become a fact. It was a fact when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, before there were ever any human beings. The fact that the continents are floating on like beds of molten lava, and that's why they
Right, but string
rub
theory
against
is
each other.
unmeasurable, right?
Well, hold the string theory.
So,
leave
some of
the
it
is-
leave the
because you
oh
can
no,
measure
stop
gene-
stop. Talk to the hand. Talk to the hand. Okay, I don't want to get into string theory right now because that's like weird physics stuff. It's highly controversial. I want to stick with the plate tectonics, which I like. so that's all right. I just want to one thing at a time. So plate tectonics says that the ground we stand on is floating on like a bed of molten lava, and occasionally you get fractures and cracks, and the two plates rub against each other, and that causes all of a sudden you get buildup of pressure, and then it explodes into shaking and rolling, and we get earthquakes, right? And you also get continental drift, so the continents actually move around very slowly over time. So there's lots of explanatory power for the plate tectonics theory, right? Now, whether it counts as a theory or a fact, I think it's a matter of like, I don't think you could say there's like a rigorous a way where you'd say, well, these observations, this theory, now we're going to say this is the fact. Like one day it magically becomes a fact. But the thing is, we might be a time where we might say, okay, there's enough evidence for this, sufficient evidence such that we know that plate tectonics is the correct theory of plates. But the fact that we live on plates, on molten lava, has always been true. And the fact that the Earth contains such plates and that the Earth's crust is made up of these plates was true before there were ever any human scientists or even any human beings. That's what the correspondence theory says. Yeah.
So due to that logic, you would have to be in that time period basically to understand that perspective, right?
What time
Or
period?
for that to be true, you would have to be in that time period, right?
Like in the Jurassic period or something?
Yeah, so say like Big Bang Theory, you would have to be there in existence to understand that that would be true.
It's like
No.
an unopened shrine.
So unless it's written down or something we don't know that it would be
No,
true.
that's not. I don't think that's true either. Like
Okay.
there's like you can extrapolate. You can
maybe
extrapolate
something
through
that's-
scientific means, right? Go
Maybe
ahead.
something that's fact that is able to give us more insight to new questions and new answers has a better basis than something that doesn't progress us. And technically we'll be progressing forever, maybe. I don't know. Yeah.
But that's I mean that's like that's like the I don't know.
But that's what gives something potency. Is what I'm
It gives
trying to
it gives it value. It's there's a certain word for that. It's
say. But that's human value.
it's fertile. It has the capacity for growing other truths. Like there's like a particular word when the scientists use when they talk about some discovery that it's going to lead to other discoveries. That's escaping me now. Can you think of what it is?
So how do we escape the monopole thing where it's like mathematically monopoles exist, simple north poles and simple south poles exist in nature somewhere without the other half,
Yeah.
but we've never found that, and it's not really disprovable because we could search forever and not find monopoles, but it doesn't disprove that there are no monopoles because there might just be no monopoles in the areas that we've searched. So it's like monopoles are
Yeah.
true, but this like you can't disprove them.
I think they were actually able to make one.
Can you not measure them?
I think they actually made one.
If we could find it, that would be really awesome.
I think they actually
If
did.
we
I was
could
reading
make a
something
straight
about how they
north
finally
pole.
did
So,
it. Yeah.
So either they found a genuine monopole or they didn't, right? It's not like they're both monopoles and and there are no monopoles
It's like
and there's
plutonic solids. Like you don't find plutonic solids in nature specifically on the
yeah.
but they're like incorporated in the majority of our lives.
I don't know much about monopoles, but I'd say there's three statements that are mutually exclusive. Statement A, there are no monopoles. Statement B, there are some monopoles. Statement 3, every pole is a monopole. Right? I mean, like all those are mutually exclusive choices. One of them is true. Now, maybe we can't know whether there are any monopoles or not. Maybe the putative monopoles are not true monopoles, right? But to try to ask a question is to assume an answer. And to engage in discovery and theorizing is to look for an answer. You're assuming that reality is one determinate way and you're trying to figure out what that is. Yeah, good. Did you have any other? So belief is different from truth, right? Will you acknowledge that it's possible to believe something that isn't true? Is it possible to have a false belief? Let me ask that question. Have you ever had a false belief? So what does it mean when you had a false belief?
You didn't get the facts right. Or
Yeah.
you didn't know the full truth, I guess.
Something that you believe something that came to you that was actually false, but you had no way of figuring out whether that was true or not.
Yeah. You didn't have all the information.
Or desire.
Yeah, maybe you believed in Santa Claus, or maybe you thought that maybe you thought that your father was morally perfect. Maybe maybe you trusted the government. You know, there's lots of things that you grow up later and you figure out, oh, what was I thinking? Yeah.
So to go off of like what we were saying earlier with plate tectonics, a lot of people with false beliefs, a lot of people back in the day didn't understand a lot of the scientific information that we do now, so they had relied on other forms of...
They had a different reality.
No,
well,
they
had,
did not.
They had a different form of
They had the same reality.
expressing
They had different
the
beliefs.
world
All right, yeah,
around
fair
them.
enough, yeah. No.
Or observing the world around them, right? So like people in the Incas didn't believe the same, you know, like with Andres Fault, like with all those earthquakes and certain things that occurred naturally, they wouldn't be able to figure that out scientifically, so they didn't have all
Yeah.
the beliefs necessary, or all the information.
So not all false beliefs are blameworthy, right? So can I be blamed for believing Santa Claus when I'm 5 years old? Probably not. How about when I'm 12? Well, you know, maybe, I had a nephew, he was a late bloomer, I can't remember, he was like 10 or 11 and still believes in Santa Claus. But you think about, like, you grow up in Aboriginal culture and the world's full of magic, and you believe that epilepsy is caused by evil spirits, and when someone in your tribe gets sick, that some of the enemy tribe shaman put a hex on you, it's time to go to war. You know, that's, maybe you can't be blamed for that, right? Maybe that's, you know, growing up in that culture and being immersed in that, that's the best evidence for you. That doesn't mean your belief's true. It's unfortunate but false, right? This is one of the reasons why the Yanomama are always fighting against the other tribes, is because every time somebody gets sick with some tropical disease, of which there are lots in the Brazilian rainforest, they go and fight a war because they think somebody's put a hex on somebody. And who would do such a thing? Why is those bastards over there across the river? Let's go kill them all, right? And so you get perpetual warfare, and you get lots of bad things happening based on superstitious beliefs, which is one of the reasons why, you know, truth is useful.
I mean, they had a reality, but their reality was, of course, very different from ours because they had different input of
Now,
information.
when you say they had a reality, do you mean something different than they had different beliefs?
I mean, like, even philosophers thinking they had a different perception of what life was and why they
So cultural,
Right, but-
cultural beliefs.
culture can kind of change the way that reality is in some sense. But I think we're naive to think that we know so much now
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, how
compared
crazy-
to, let's say, 1,000 years. Or what if, you know, one day we're able to upgrade our minds and we could think at 1,000,000 IQ? How would we perceive the world? Would it be much different than we would now? Or would it be just vastly underestimated that it wouldn't even work in our minds now?
It's an interesting question. A little off topic. I want to come back to this thing because this is super important and fundamental, and maybe we can hit that later on after we sort of get a handle on these. So, when you say that, oh, this primitive tribe that believes in evil spirits and hexes and so on and so forth, they have different. You said they have different reality, and people sometimes talk that way. But I think one of the things that philosophers say is really important is getting precise about language. So one thing I would ask is, do you mean anything different than they have different beliefs and different perceptions of the world than we do? I mean, do you think that there's like a separate reality that they live in, and in that reality there really are evil spirits and there you know really are hexes, and it seems like, what if you go and visit them? Then whose reality is it, right? Do you bring your reality with you? Do the two realities merge? You get into all these weird questions where it seems like that's just an imprecise way of talking about people having different perceptions. And there's a fundamental difference between appearance and reality. And make it put perception, and I ran out of room here.
Kind of sounds Nietzsche and competitive if it was, though.
Say that again?
It'd be kind of competitive, like a dominance of wills then. Whose belief is stronger? Whose desire is stronger?
Well, it's, and some people have this sort of idea. This is actually a kind of, this grows out of the postmodern movement. And basically you had like a bunch of Marxists in the 50s who kind of like down and out because liberalism is doing really well, and the revolutions weren't happening, at least not enough of them. And so people are like, well, they start to say, well, it's like everything's relative. And it's not a matter of like what's true or false. It's a question about who has a dominant narrative and who has power. And you get this idea that it's just sort of there's no such thing as objectivity. It's all a question about whose biases are behind the guns. And I'd say that's a really, I'm not imputing that belief to you, but that's a really damaging view, I think, because it sees philosophy as kind of a power game. Now, certainly there are power dynamics that go on in academia. Guys, it's pretty awful, actually. But I think in a more, pure way, when you think about, well, how do I form my own beliefs and how do I think critically? You want to try to be objective and not think about in terms of winning the next argument or persuading the world that your view is the true world, so you can be like a Nietzschean Superman and declare dominance and bend the world to your will by getting them all to accept your philosophical ideas. The idea is that you want to understand reality the way it actually is, and that's going to help you in your life, and it's going to help other people if they really understand the world as it is. And I think the superstitious beliefs that people have that lead them to do things that aren't in their interests is a good example of that. And it's also a good example. Epilepsy is a very very treatable disease in Western societies that have modern medicine based on the correspondence theory of truth, which is the foundation for the scientific method and all modern medicine. And you have one way of proving that that's a better theory than evil spirits is you take the guy who's got he's got epilepsy, and you do have the shaman put on the scary mask and and wave a rattle and scare away all the evil spirits and do incantations, and then you got the Western neurosurgeon or some pharmaceuticals or something like that. And you can compare the two, and you get maybe a temporary result with the one method, and the other method you get control and something approaching a cure. Yeah, did you have your hand up, or are you just stretching? Okay. So we just got a couple of minutes left. Let me make sure to read the correspondence theory of truth handout, and I think on Monday we're going to talk about the ethics of belief article, since all of you had so many interesting things to say and challenging questions. And I think this question and answer thing, this idea of there's our 2-minute warning, of challenging one another, that's like a big part of critical thinking. It's debate, it's trying to keep an open mind, it's comparing ideas, but that's all predicated on this idea of what are we all after? Well, we're all after truth. And what does that mean? Well, the truth, the way the world is, as opposed to how it may seem to us. And that it's beneficial to each one of us to understand the world as it is and not be laboring under delusions or false beliefs or misconceptions about how it is, because that's going to help us to get through life. So I think there's lots of, you think about your health, you think about human nature, you think about your relationships, all those things, you run into trouble if you don't think critically about them. If you think, for example, I don't know, you get cancer, and you do what Steve Jobs did, which is like do this, macrobiotic diet and a bunch of not to say about Buddhism, but if you got cancer, Buddhism might not be your best approach. And maybe it'd be a good idea to get it treated before it's inoperable. So what happened was he waited too long, and cancer spread, and then he died. And this is like one of the most brilliant, I'd say one of the most brilliant engineers in the 20th century, 21st century, giant, like the wealthiest company in America, and arguably like the smartest guy in the U.S. And he died based on what I would call a superstitious belief and skepticism about modern scientific cures, which I think is highly ironic. But it shows sometimes these things can be life and death. And on that note, on Tuesday we'll talk some more about the beliefs and the ethics of belief.